Well, a warm welcome to members and friends to Chatham House, where we have been convening on the big issues in international affairs for over 100 years. Thank you for joining us this evening to help us continue this tradition. My name is Dr Samir Puri. I am the recently arrived at Chatham House Director for Global Governance and Security, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr Comfort Iro from International Crisis Group. Before we start the event, just a few housekeeping notes. This discussion is on the record, and it's being recorded, and it's also being live streamed as well. I'd encourage you, if you're tweeting about this event, to use the hashtag #CHEvents and @Chatham House. When we come to the Q&A in the second half of the event, please raise your hands to ask questions. And if you're called upon to ask a question, you can stay seated. A microphone will be brought to your chair. Please ask the individual to identify themselves and before stating your question. Attendees can also submit questions throughout the event using the Q&A box, and it will appear at the bottom of their Zoom feed. I'll ask you to unmute to ask your question, potentially, but if you prefer to stay off the microphone, then you can indicate this in the question when you type it in. Now, I'm going to introduce Dr Comfort Iro, who is your third visit, I think, in terms of this particular headline event. Dr Comfort Iro was appointed Crisis Group's President and CEO in December 2021. She joined the organisation as West Africa Project Director in 2001. So that's 20 years already at Crisis Group before you became the president. In that time, you're also the interim vice president in January 2021. Dr Iro has spent her entire career working on or in conflict-affected countries. In between her two tenures at Crisis Group, she served as Deputy Africa Programme Director for the International Centre for Transitional Justice, and prior to that, Political Affairs Officer and Policy Advisor to the Special Representative of the Secretary-General UN Mission in Liberia. She has a PhD from the LSE, University of London, and is also the chair of the board of the Rift Valley Institute and sits on the editorial board of various journals. Now, on to our event, which is, of course, the International Crisis Group's annual publication, 10 Conflicts to Watch in 2025. Now, conflict is something that is acute, it's permissive, it's pervasive, and it's becoming worse. And I think that's probably one of the first things I wanted to ask you about, is because you conduct this exercise every year, what's your overall impression in conducting this exercise this year, when I'd say concern around armed conflict is at its highest that I think it's been at any stage I can remember, but not only conflicts that are active, but conflicts that could become active. And I notice your list combines both categories and types of conflict.
No, thank you very much, and congratulations to you on your new post here at Chatham House as well. And it's a pleasure to be moderated by you. I should clarify that I would love to still be the chair of the Rift Valley Institute, but I had to step down when I became president, but it's still an institute that is close to me as well. You know, when I reflect back on the, I think, nearly 13, and I've just seen my boss, one of my bosses walk in as well. When I reflect on the 13 years or so that we've been doing the 10 conflicts, and bearing in mind that Crisis Group is a conflict prevention organisation, early warning, and you know, we tend to look to organisations like Chatham House and where I used to be, IISS, and others who focus really on sort of the big power of rivalry and geopolitics. But it's very clear to us at Crisis Group that everything that we do, everything that we focus on in terms of trying to avert, de-escalate, resolve and warn about conflicts is really now overshadowed by sort of big power rivalry. And there is an interesting through line in this year's theme, which is the return of President Trump as well. So when I look at all the 10 conflicts, bar 2, although given what's happened now with US aid, there was at least 2 conflicts that I didn't think would necessarily have significant impact because of the return of Trump, but I'm sort of recalculating my own positions on that. But except for two of those, Myanmar and Sudan, and we can come back to discuss those if you want, it's very clear to me that what binds all these conflicts together is that there's going to be a definitive change in US policy that will impact a number of the conflicts that we've put on our list, for good or bad reasons as well. There are reasons, we expect some innovations and opportunities, but it's also clear already from the last 2.5 weeks that we've seen Trump in power, that some of the decisions that he's taken have glaring repercussions. You know, the idea also that a US president would assert the idea of cutting one of the key principles of international relations, that also, I think, for most of US's allies, I think it's a shock therapy that they are the first point of in his rear view window as opposed to adversaries as well. Sort of also, I think it's quite clarifying to see the raft of executive orders that have shared impact on a number of conflicts that we're looking at. I also mentioned USAID as well. So for us, it's about big power rivalries, about geopolitical tensions. It's very clear that the rule book is no longer the same, but we do see opportunities. We do see an expectation of change. We do also see that it's not business as usual, which is not a bad thing. I do think that some of the conflicts that we're looking at, there's a sense in which they were stuck and that we need to try something different. The question is, if what you try is different, leads to further mayhem, then we're really in the wrong direction as well. So the other issue also, although he's been in power for 2.5 weeks also, there's still things that we don't know. There's still a lot of uncertainty. But a really good sense already is that he did say he was going to move fast on certain conflicts as soon as he came into office. One happened just as he was coming into the office, which is Israel-Gaza. I think there is something worth unpacking there. And then the one that he's had to reverse his own timeline is Ukraine, because suddenly there's, you know, the aspirations versus reality of governing sort of collides straight away.
Yeah. Well, let's unpack that right now, because one of the challenges, I'm sure, with actually, you know, hitting the final submission for this particular report is things change really quickly. And I think it was released at the start of January. And so just tell me a bit about the Middle East and how much that's moved on, even since this report has been finalised, but also why you think it's moved on in the way it has.
So I mean, look, I wouldn't say it's necessarily moved on. I think there's still a lot that we don't know. And as I speak to you, Prime Minister Netanyahu is in Washington, speaking with the president as well. So it's not quite clear what's going on or what the talking points will be and what the outcome there will be. But Trump was very clear in his own messaging. That he wanted, you know, he wants to be a deal maker. He wants to be a peacemaker. His legacy, and I think we should take him seriously at his word. It's a separate issue as to judging the quality of the peacemaking, but he wants to be a peacemaker. And he said all hell will break out with Hamas, but there was also clear that he was pressuring the Israeli sides to get some kind of deal. And I think we have to welcome that just after the sheer scale of 15 months of just hell for both sides as well. So we have to welcome the fact that we've gotten to this moment as well. We're now on day 16, you know, where the tough question comes in about how you begin to work out phase 2, which is also to do with the governance and administration. I think there are a number of question marks about the humanitarian architecture, about aid delivery, about who you're going to work with on the Israeli side. There's a lot of vagueness. You know, it's very rare to see a peace agreement that is so vague, that is flexible, that gives options. And when one of the sides is making it very clear that the option to go to war is still very much on the table. And you also recognize that Hamas too also have some degree of flexibility. You know, that they may have been damaged, but they're not out as well. So I think there are lots of things that can go wrong in the peace deal, and it's clear that it's both pressure from the US side, and Trump owns this now. This is Trump at his peak, where he can force a number of actors, but Israel too also has its own calculations. Netanyahu certainly wanted to give Trump something of a win The question now is what happens next.
And on that note, in terms of what happens next, I took really careful note that one of the conflicts you've got listed here is to do with Iran. And of course, that's Iran, Israel, US. Is there a risk that as the situation regarding Gaza and Hamas moves on to a different stage, not resolved, but a different stage, that actually that frees up Israeli and maybe US attention to actually maximise pressure on Iran? Is that why that's included in this 10 conflicts to watch?
And you know, another way in which you can read it also is that, you know, the message that Trump gave is like, you know, look, keep your eye on the prize. And what is the prize? So one of it is about Iran, and the other one is about, you know, Trump's other ambitions around normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Let's focus on Iran. I think one thing, just stepping back, is to recognize that the region, the Middle East, is vastly different from what Trump left behind in 2020. And then, you know, it's a more assertive, more emboldened, more stronger and confident Iran. It's very different today, a sense in which it's vulnerable, lost its axis of resistance. I even had some of my colleagues calling it the axis of no resistance, or where's the resistance suddenly with Assad, your main ally, gone, Hezbollah on its back foot, you know, and all the forward-leaning forces that you had for Iran have been depleted or weaker as well. But I think there, and we say it in the 10 conflicts, and it's playing out now, there are two choices for Trump. Again, keep an eye on the fact that he really is very serious about the peacemaking. The question is whether he has the room for maneuver to get there, and understanding the calculations that everybody is going to be making, particularly Israel, that may want to make that harder for Trump as well. I mean, I think a wiser counsel around Trump would be to test out. There are two camps right now in Iran. There's one that wants to double down on weaponizing around its own nuclear capacity. But there's another camp, and it's the camp that I would urge counsel to pay attention to, the one that may be interested in some kind of diplomacy or conversations with Trump and the European community. And I think a wise counsel would suggest that you test out that proposition, you see whether there's willingness to show transparency around the enrichment, recognize that you are in a sort of slightly different position, and also recognize that one thing that you haven't lost in the last 15 months, which is quite crucial, is that the rapprochement with Saudi Arabia still holds as well. So that's the other fact that has changed since Trump came into power as well, since Trump came back into the office. Yeah.
And I want to get your views on especially some of the less geopolitically salient conflicts a bit later on. But just sticking with Trump and with deals, of course, Ukraine and European security, that's how you've titled it in the top 10, is coming. And we're all on tenterhooks, aren't we, in terms of what can and can't be achieved. Putting aside the resolve this in 24 hours, what's your sense now in terms of the elusiveness of a deal?
That's a good word. The elusiveness, and that is the key. And I think more than any other conflict, this is the one that I think is more worrying, because number one, I think that Trump and the team around him have recognized that, oh, I will deliver a deal on the first day. You know, this is when reality hits you in the face as well. So we've gone from a 100-day plan to a 6-month plan. And who knows, you know, whether this will be the year of negotiations either at the table or the battlefield as well. I think there are three things that are pretty clear to us at Crisis Group that I don't think should be negotiated away, which is around Ukraine's own sovereignty, its own ability to defend itself as well. But I think there has to be a deal, otherwise it will not be sustainable, that, you know, puts, you know, Russia on notice that there is a cost to this kind of aggression. Now, I think the art is how you strike a balance between deterrence and diplomacy. And clearly a message to Europe that we put out ourselves last November is that, are you ready? Are you ready to also show that you have the capability to defend Ukraine, and that you will also answer that question to the United States, that you're no longer reliable just on the US, but you would actually shore up your own defense as well. It's a big, tall order. But I think one thing is clear is that the US and Trump is not omnipresent.
No.
So Europe's notion that sometimes it comes across as weak and vulnerable, I think that there have been some significant clarifying moments for Europe, and you saw the conversations yesterday and today around defence capability and defence expenditure. But it's a wake-up call for Europe that it's no longer business as usual. And just one more point, there would have been some kind of negotiation this year, regardless of the administration. One is just moving at a faster pace than the other one would have as well.
I think that's a really important point, is like the conflict was entering a new phase anyway, and there had to have been some adjustment in strategy. Very long way from 2023 counter-offensive and that sort of optimism. Now, you mentioned the US is not omnipresent, and I think there's another undercurrent, certainly the one around great powers comes out very strongly from the report. Another undercurrent is sort of changing balances of global power, and Asia features quite prominently in the report. And of course, you've got the Korean Peninsula, you've got China, US. Could you just talk a little bit about the rising salience of Asia, which is, of course, during the Cold War was the site of a lot of devastating conflicts. Less so now, Myanmar aside. Myanmar, of course, is maybe the one that people know the least about, but is actually causing the most destruction in Asia. Could you talk a bit about the conflicts you cover in Asia?
Yeah, you know, one of the things that worried me when we put this together is that there was so much focus on the big power rivalry and the contestation, and what overshadows everything is the US-China tension that you know, we kept on keeping an eye on our mission of conflicts that are off the radar. And Myanmar is a classic sort of the bread and butter that people are familiar with crisis group, that we focus on those, you know, conflicts that are off the radar, that are not on the international agenda, or some that I prefer to say are deprioritized and just in the sheer scale of everything that needs to be done. It was our co-chair, Susanna Morkoro, who told us last year, guys, this is the era of Asia geopolitics. You need to sort of start thinking about what it looks like in your sort of work plan as well. I mean, I think there's one question at the back of my mind, or one issue that I'm trying to grapple with in terms of understanding that the deal maker of Trump, you know, and the art of deal making. And for those of you who will be familiar sort of with US-China politics, there are two possibilities. One is whether we'll see sort of a Nixon to China moment, and he's sort of indicated that he wants some kind of rapprochement with Xi Jinping, you know, and he's walked back from his 60% tariff, and you've seen that China itself has gone through the WTO, but he still wants that conversation with Xi Jinping. And can the two leaders, continuing from what Biden did, and I think we should credit Biden for trying to make sure that there was still sort of communication between Beijing and Washington, but continue to have that high-level talks, agree certain fundamentals between the two leaders. I think the big area will always be Taiwan. The big area would always be how you accommodate, you know, China in this sort of geo-economical landscape, rather than trying to constrain it. So that's one possibility, which looks a little bit, you know, there's a lot of possibilities in there because it would lower the temperature in a number of hotspots in the region. The other possibility is you kind of like see a reverse Nixon approach, which would be where Trump seeks to, and here's the link between Ukraine and China, where, you know, in return for Russia sort of pulling back, it agrees to freeze the conflict with Ukraine, forces Ukraine to accept that a fifth of its territory is gone, tries to loosen the relationship between Russia and China, and then tries to sort of, you know, put a wedge through China and Russia in return for building out different spheres of influence as well. There will be losers in that, because then you have question marks about what's the future of the Philippines, the South China Sea, and the carefully weaving together of some important regional alliances like the AUKUS and the Quad as well, and what that means for China and the region as well.
It's really mind-boggling to think of like a reverse Nixon, but the number of pieces it would have to align across multiple chessboards makes it feel like it would be something more out of a sort of a fiction novel than reality. But do you think it's...
Well, look, you know, what's really interesting about Trump, and I hate to say that it's been quite interesting to see how what he's gotten so far from his very bullish diplomacy, if you can dare attach diplomacy to what Trump is doing, and this highly transactional. But look what happened with Colombia. Look what happened with Canada, and look what happened in Mexico. There are two narratives. Of course, Trump, will come home to his constituency and he says, I got you that deal. I told you we're not messing around. I sent out a warning to Canada. I sent out a warning to Mexico. I think what worries me is that in that fast pace, sort of throwing down the gauntlet at everybody, particularly your allies, you create distrust. You shatter years of alliances and relationships. You legitimize certain bad behavior. But you also, after sort of decades of carefully weaving some very difficult and complex deterrence frameworks, you now sow doubt into those frameworks. And you give the other side, the adversaries, the chance to test the waters, to say, oh, look, the US cannot be trusted amongst its allies. Allies are looking vulnerable. They don't trust the insurance policy that they have with the US. Will they bet on us? But also, can we also be, go for annexation? Can we wake up one day and say, I'm going to grab this land? So you are licensing a particular kind of behavior, and you're unraveling a very carefully constructed deterrent architecture that, by the way, you created and you've been a beneficiary about. So this notion that America, somehow gives us this like, woe is me, the world is sort of like taking advantage of me. You created this architecture and it served you very well, and you're unraveling in it in a very dangerous way that could backfire on you as well, because it's not as if there isn't another way in which to think about this, especially with your allies. You heard what Van der Leyen and Christine said this weekend, that they got the message as well. So a lot of allies are getting the message, but they could also miscalculate as well.
And it's interesting because it's also a function of us having this conversation in February 25, so barely a month after the change of administration in the US. There's this optimism around deal making at different levels. There's also, as you rightly point out, the great fear of basically, breaching this taboo of territorial change and providing potential, conquerors a narrative that they can point to the US and say that. So we don't know where this is going to go, but I want to move on to some of the less geopolitically salient, but nonetheless really critical conflicts that you cover. You mentioned Myanmar. I was in Asia myself in February 2021 when the coup occurred, so that's actually now coming on to 4 years since
that's the day I became interim vice president, and I got a message that says, welcome to the world.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you've actually literally been tracking that in your current position. You've got Sudan as well. And I always think, there are conflicts which they involve the resources, the egos of the great powers. And there are those that don't really do that. But Sudan, although it doesn't have the geopolitical salience of other conflicts, has an immense amount of human suffering that's going on. 12 million people have been displaced. And I noticed that you mentioned that. And I just want you to talk us through, especially for those of us who don't necessarily follow the conflict in Sudan so closely, why you think it's so acutely important to highlight it in this report.
It's funny you say we don't follow it. This country is a penholder at the Security Council on Sudan, so it should, by virtue of that, be at the top end of concerns. And I don't know how many times I've said it, but 20 years ago, that we had this big campaign, Save Darfur. It was all over sort of international media, the humanitarian plight.
This was the Janjaweed at the time,
Yeah. So there were, and question marks as to whether it was genocide or not. So there was a big sort of activism spurred on by various faith groups, activists, human rights groups, what have you. Right from Europe through to the US as well. So, and I think it's a reminder also that the energy, the room has been absorbed by so many other competing interests that Sudan oftentimes doesn't. get the attention. I would say that it's deprioritized, not that it doesn't get attention, because I was at the UNGA Week, UN High-Level Week in September. There were 3 or 4 different meetings on Sudan. Also, virtually every newspaper in the East Coast, so whether it's Washington Post, bless you, whether it's Washington Post or New York Times, because the Emir of the Emiratis, UAE, was coming to Washington, they featured Sudan, but in terms of its geopolitical relevance as well. So it has geopolitical ramifications. You've got a number of countries piling in on either side of the conflict. One of the drivers of this conflict is that both sides have access to manpower, to resources, to money, to ammunition as well. So that's the geopolitical reality. The difference between Sudan 2025 and Sudan 2003, 2004 is the constituency of actors. They're not Western actors who are able to shape, lead, pressure or navigate this crisis. This time it's the region, it's the Gulf, and also and other European actors. It's also in Asia as well. So that's the geopolitical factor. But also, I think it's a if you wanted to look for an example where there's a limits of Western influence and pressure, and where other actors have a bigger sort of pocket of money, Sudan is a classic case of that as well. And I think one of the things that I was re-editing in my mind, where I said to you at the beginning that I didn't think Sudan or Myanmar would necessarily feel the impact of a Trumpian return. I do actually worry about what it means for the temporary freezing of US's international assistance and aid, although we've seen the caveat around the humanitarian space as well. But there's still question marks about what that means for a number of people who work on Sudan as well.
It would be remiss of me not to ask us, but a question you probably get asked quite a lot.
Yeah.
Is about the conflicts that haven't necessarily made the list. So DRC being one, just in terms of what's been happening in and around Goma in relation to Rwanda. Maybe talk us through some of the conflicts that didn't make the list that you also think are important to highlight. There's ones to watch for this year.
I'm looking over at that corner over there of my colleagues as well, and their own reactions to this. I mean, if I told you how many emails go past between all of us, I mean, it's not a beauty contest, but, the litany of conflicts. And, we were made the offer, because it's our anniversary year, that, do you want to expand it to 11? Do you want to expand it to 14? I said, well, why not 30, given that we're 30, and given that we do cover about 55 conflicts alive in terms of our staffing being based in those places, and 70 in total. But we have to be disciplined, because we're very clear, we're asking you to watch this for various reasons: opportunities, reversals, geopolitical landscape as well. My colleagues who cover the Central Africa region and also the Africa program were watching the diplomacy, the summitry that was taking place between Rwanda and DRC, led by Angola, and they saw a deal, but they saw it sort of being collapsed when Kagame chose not to go ahead with it. So there are already indications that things were going in the wrong direction as well. But we had to make a calculation. Look, I will admit, we replaced the Sahel with Syria, for example, because it was a matter of which one provides you both with a sense of opportunity, concern, and has sort of serious ramifications. That doesn't mean the Sahel doesn't, but you have to choose. There was a minute when Mexico was going to go off the list. Yeah. We weren't going to put Mexico on the list.
US-Mexico is on the list, very topical.
And there was pushback even amongst us as well. Even I hummed and hawed. Should Mexico have been on the list as well? So there's no science behind it. So we do make a calculated guess, but it's also because we know we're going to put out other lists as well. So the other significant list that we put out this last week was the European Union Global Watch List, with a very clear message to the European Union about places where we think that it has leverage to shape certain things, and certainly we believe that it had leverage or has leverage and pressures if it chooses to use it vis-a-vis the Great Lakes, for example, as well.
Yeah, let's just carry on our discussion.
And also, just to say, just ahead of the Africa Union summit, there's a clear message also to the Africa Union about how it's using or not using its own diplomacy, its own heft on a number of conflicts that it has a role in. So you'll see the Great Lakes mentioned there. And we use other tools. So there was a statement that was released last week on the DRC and on our podcast, so that shows you the magnitude, that even though it doesn't appear on the watch list, there are other ways in which we address it as well.
Yeah, and I was just going to carry on our conversation on the stage just for one moment before we go to the Q&A. And just last point of interest from me is really just the overarching sense of pattern. So I noted in your last year's report, you mentioned that there's now more conflicts that are being resolved in military ways rather than through negotiation, certainly compared to the 1990s. You've talked a bit about the salience of geopolitical competition, great power competition. You've mentioned quite a bit about interventions in different ways by state actors, maybe by proxy through funding, everything else like that. Are there any other overarching trends that you wanted to highlight that have come to your sort of attention by doing this work, but also areas where positive influence can be achieved? You mentioned the African Union as well, but with that sense of what these trends are, where attention should be going in terms of conflict resolution more generally.
Yeah. I mean, so just on the states, I think what is also clear to us is that it's increasing state assertiveness.
Yeah.
So for a very long time, there's a lot of focus on non-state actors, and they're still there, and some of these non-state actors are proxies for states as well. But it's very clear for anybody who has any doubt, the state is back in a very powerful way, both as an actor shaping facts on the ground, but also as a mediator. So we've seen a number of states who are, wearing the banner of mediators who have a view on the conflict as well. So they're both part of the conflict, but they're also mediating the conflict. I do worry about how various leaders may misread, overreact to certain activities. As I said at the beginning, it's a sense of shock therapy for allies as well, in terms of I'm coming after you first before I go for the adversaries as well. So, but also as a sense in that you can strike a good deal with those adversaries as well. And as a conflict prevention organisation, the one thing that is really sort of interesting to me is whether I should now start thinking about trade and tariffs as conflict reducing or conflict inducing as well.
Right.
So, and I say that because a number of states are making their calculations that can, raise the temperature in a way that can cause other sorts of harm as well. So the trade war, if it's not managed in a way that leads to rapprochement, or at least an understanding, high-level conversations between Trump and Xi Jinping, what does that mean for the region? A region where China is very anxious about the US having a view on its backyard as well. I do worry also that if you're licensing the idea of state expansionism, that you start, we see the rebirth, recreation of spheres of influence as well. And what does that mean? That, one major power in a region can decide the fate of a number of other players in the region as well. So there is reason to be worried. The rules are clearly changing. We did say it was a year of lawlessness. The rules-based order is consigned to the museum, as one of our trustees said. That's quite a clarifying message. And for anybody who, has any notions of that, this is quite a worrying development as well. So.
Well, listen, I'm sure the audience is going to have a lot of questions, including online as well. So I'll give you a second to pour yourself a glass of water and catch your breath if you want.
Thanks, yeah.
But when the microphone does come to you, as I say, you can stay seated. Please identify yourself and make sure you ask preferably concise question. But please, feel free to ask about the conflicts that we have discussed, do also ask about conflicts perhaps that haven't been discussed, but also I'd encourage questions on these overarching themes and patterns, because I think that's one of the real values of an exercise like this, is actually to be able to take a step back and, if the rules of the road are changing, as they are, 30 years, as you said, in terms of the length of time crisis group has existed, that's the post-Cold War heyday and the optimism around mediated solutions, UN peacekeeping, all that sort of thing. And it's been a slow slide into this more state-centric world. I worked in Donbass in 2014 with the OSCE mission, which was mind-blowing to think that there was an annexation, a territorial annexation of Crimea and parts of the Donbass perpetrated by a major state actor, and that they got away with it. And that was coming off an era of working on 9/11, post 9/11 conflict, counter-terrorism, armed groups. So we really are in a very, very different world. And of course, states have more destructive potential to wreak havoc against each other than armed groups tend to, just as a general principle. So there's a lot of, I think, alarm that I would certainly take from this around some of these overarching trends as well. But let's take a couple of questions in a row. Maybe we can start with the gentleman who's got his hand up right there.
Thank you. Nick Westcott at SOAS. Hi.
I owe Nick a favour as well. Sorry, Nick.
You mentioned at the end one of your conclusions that the slide into lawlessness is set to continue. I wonder if you think that's true in two ways. One, there are states that are disintegrating, and that's happening across the Sahel. It looks like it's happening in DRC. But secondly, it's the invitation for those states who are not disintegrating and can grab something nearby to do so, which appears to be what Rwanda is doing and may happen. And where it's not geostrategically critical to one or other of the great powers, that will just continue. So do you think these are the conflicts that are actually going to be most persistent and most difficult to resolve, because nobody has a real interest in resolving them, and some even have an interest in them continuing? Thank you. Oh, and you didn't mention Greenland. No.
Oh, no.
Okay, Greenland. And let's take one other before we come to it. And the lady just right in front there.
Hi, Isabel with Constellation Energy. Recently, The Economist put out an article, or maybe like a video, about women being involved in ceasefire agreements, and saying that if there's at least one woman involved in a peace agreement, it's way more likely to, last. And I was wondering why there aren't enough women who are involved in creating peace agreements.
Great, let's take those two to begin with. So we've got the persistence of conflicts in Greenland and women in mediation.
I mean, there are lots of factors behind the persistence of conflict, but I want to go back to, one point is that, as I said, the rules are being written, and the principles that would shape and guide relations between states are also being rewritten. We've seen already one around sort of non-aggression. So you mentioned Donbass, 2014, and Crimea, and for me that was sort of the original sin, in contemporary times, if you want to put it that way as well. And when you see the traditional, when you see the rule makers become the rule breakers, then it opens the door to all sorts of justifications. Why can't I do? And you can't lecture anybody anymore. You can't go round and cite norms and rules to people anymore, because they'll say, well, you did it, why can't I do it as well? So it's been interesting, Nick, to listen to the narrative between, as Kagame's been trying to explain his actions. And, oftentimes, I mean, generally speaking, states have gone with the justification of the Houthi genocide, sort of militias, remnants in the east. But I think that justification may have run its course, because there are other agendas at play for somewhere like Goma and North Kivu and South Kivu. These are places that are wealthy resource, sort of copper, 5% for DRC is renowned for 5% of copper and 6% of coltan reserves in this place. So you begin to understand why a leader can say one thing to justify it, but we also know that the real undercurrents, and the same for Greenland. Yes, in the name of national interest, I can decide that I want to expand my territory into a particular region and make a case for it. So why stop there? The same with Panama as well. So, you know, that's the other country as well. So the rules are being written, Nick. The question is, who has the capacity to stop anybody from doing what they are doing? The Africa Union, however, on this particular issue, was very clear that the borders of the colonial period into the post-colonial period would not be rewritten. And here we see a real violation of one of the core principles of the Africa Union.
Yeah, and with the question on the role of women.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a good question to be asking it now. It's even a little more complicated given the pushback we're seeing in certain areas. You know, there are some women at the table. I think we still need to do better. You have to ask a man. You have to ask the men why women aren't at the table. I have my own answers, but it's not one for me to always beat the drum about. But there are a number of important women peacemakers that we see out there. I would want to be careful and not say that, you know, you add women and stir and therefore you get a peace deal. But you certainly do get more nuance. You certainly do get a more inclusive approach. You certainly avoid the elite pacting that you sometimes see in peace deals, and you get to see a peace deal that deals with both the grievances, the root causes of the conflict, and tries to answer the question of accountability as well. Yeah. So it's more societal in that respect, and we need to sort of think through who sits on the table at different tables as well. There isn't just one table.
Great. Let's take a pair more here. The gentleman at the very front, the blue jackets.
Thank you very much. Robert Walter, I'm a former Member of Parliament here in the House of Commons. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the role of the United Nations in this, because the latter half of the last century, we all made the United Nations a cornerstone of the rules-based order. Trump has shown really utter contempt for the UN and its agencies, and also the Bretton Woods institutions. Do you believe now that the Security Council is toothless, that the United Nations has any role in these conflicts that you highlight?
Yeah.
And we'll take a question from the lady just there with her hand up, right in the middle.
Thank you very much. This is Nora with King's College. I also want to go into a similar direction. So we've looked at big powers and the competition of US and China, but we also spoke about Rwanda and Sudan and the influence of regional rising powers as like the UAE, Saudi Arabia. I want to understand what your take is on regional powers and their rise in the international power play, and how that also impacts the influence of global powers in these settings, also maybe looking at Syria now.
Super, thank you. We'll take these two, yeah.
It's a good. So one thing I would say in terms of all these conflicts as well, and about Trump as well, is that, you know, he's a symptom of, you know, this current sort of disorder and turbulence. I mean, he didn't create and he didn't lead the demise of multilateralism. It was already in decline, and we should remember that some of the damage that has been done to multilateralism didn't happen under Republican government as well. So I think we should make sure history recognizes that some of these catastrophes, the human suffering, the green lighting of certain conflicts, the double standards and hypocrisy, I could go on, didn't all happen on the altar of a Republican government. You know, some of it happened with other administrations. I think it's worth noting that as well. There are some agencies also that the US may like to protect, and, you know, Elise Stefanaki, I think she's still down to be nominated. I don't know that she's finished well, I don't know if the Senate has pronounced on her confirmation, she was very clear that they will protect those agencies that they felt were an arm of US policy as well. So she singled out certain agencies that would be shielded, we think will be shielded from the US sort of reach vis-a-vis the UN as well. But it's true that the Security Council, you know, the Chamber of International Peace and Security is ever more dysfunctional than it was in the past as well. But you know, we've seen these kind of crises before, so this is not unusual. But I think this is the worst that I've seen in terms of multilateralism and the UN admitting itself that it doesn't have a good response. So you know, we see that the banning of UNRWA. The key agency that is supposed to help deal comprehensively with the humanitarian crisis, and humanitarian delivery and education for Gaza, how does it do that? We see the Security Council also presiding over, turning a blind eye to the annexation of the West Bank. How does it then become an arbiter for peace and security? We see that it doesn't have a good response to a number of the crises that we see in Sudan. It's almost marginalized itself out of relevance. You know, so even on the conflicts that don't necessarily have the geopolitical impact that you suggest as well, there's a sense in which the Security Council, the UN, becomes sort of sideline. And nonetheless, as I say this, all those who cast aspersions on the UN, all those who shred the Charter of the UN, all those who beat it up also turn to it to help it with the humanitarian delivery. The trucks that you see going through every single country, they've been sanctioned by the UN. So it's relevant when it suits the various powers, and then they dismiss it when it doesn't play to its agenda as well. On the question that you asked about regional powers, I mean, look, I started off my own research looking at the role of regional powers and regional organizations, because at the end of the day, they are key players. They have a view, they create their own facts in the region. We're seeing this. Two regions are in now direct contestation with each other in the Great Lakes, the East Africa Community and SADC. You've got two leaders who would normally turn to be mediators on the continent, shouting at each other. And the UN, the African Union, is stuck in terms of what to do. You raise Syria. I think there's a possibility there. There's a good story that you could possibly tell there. And it's very interesting listening to Tom Fletcher the other day, acknowledging that even Jelani, aka al-Sharia, recognizes that he needs to avoid the mistake of Libya, to avoid external actors piling in, needs to avoid the mistake of Afghanistan, which made it very difficult to work with the Taliban, and also recognize the consequences of an Iraq type of scenario. So there are lots of options there if there's a way in which we can get them to work, you know, more consistently and recognise those challenges as well.
Fantastic. I'm going to come back to the room in a moment. I think you've answered Margaret Nowicki's question that came in online, which was
That's a very dear friend of mine. I didn't realise.
The UN's role in resolving these conflicts. I think that was a similar question to one you asked. I'm going to take a couple more really interesting other angles that have come up online. Anna Prohl has asked, how do you assess Claudia Sheinbaum's ability to counter Trump's aggression towards Mexico, presumably a reference to the deployment or the stated deployment of Mexican troops to the border? And Kai Brown Jacobson has asked, we've seen the number of armed conflicts and humanitarian crises increase significantly in recent years. How do you assess the world's capacity for investment in peace building and effective prevention of violent conflicts? What do state and non-state actors need to do to improve these capabilities effectively?
Those are two good questions. I mean, so to go back to the lady who asked about women peacemakers, number one, you've got, you know, a significant woman sitting in front of you from Afghanistan who really did try very hard and continues to play a significant role, Fatima Galani. I think we should recognise her as a key negotiator and brave enough to decide that I will engage with the Taliban as well. So, and then you have an interesting state leader in the form of the president of Mexico as well. And this is what I was saying, that at one level it's shock therapy to allies, but it also goes back to my remark that Trump is not omnipresent, that the other side does have agency, depending on how they choose to yield and use that agency as well. So, she's been very clear. And it was the same with AMLO as well. The relationship between her predecessor and Trump was not a good one. There was a lot of shouting and screaming and sort of throwing down the gauntlet. But it also speaks to Trump's style. And it's important to understand the style of the man and the words of the man. So the style is to bid high, throw down the big sort of hammer, and then you start beginning to negotiate as well. So we've got a 30-day reprieve. The question is what happens in that 30-day reprieve. Has she shown herself to be an astute negotiator? Because, there are things that Mexico can also do. It's not some pushover country. There are things that it could do to also make things very complicated, but she's also in a very precarious situation at home. As to, it ties to back to the question about sort of the architecture that's supposed to sort of be the arbiter of crisis management. This is the year where there's supposed to be a review of the Peacebuilding Commission. This is the year there's supposed to be a ministerial on peacekeeping in Berlin. So these, there's still value in these instruments in various places. For example, there is a conversation taking place today about whether you rehat the Kenyan police, international police force, into a peacekeeping force for Haiti as well. So despite the gloominess and the question marks about the viability of the UN in the sense of a crisis mode, there are still opportunities for using these instruments very carefully to either avert, de-escalate, or to help build the process to resolution. Certainly, the UN has a potential role that it can play in Syria, for example. When you think about the litany of things that the new authorities need to do, want to do, a national conference, you're going to need the UN to help you with that, for example. Aid delivery, you're going to need the UN to help you with that. So I wouldn't necessarily write it off.
Such an important point. Our eyes are always drawn to the UN Security Council, but the UN is far more than just that.
Yeah.
It remains one of the first responders of first choice for many crises and conflicts. I think the gentleman in the grey jacket just here had his hand up, waiting patiently.
Thank you. I'm Len Namwe, a former minister from Liberia, and she very well articulated all the conflicts that are actually happening now. But when I look in West Africa, I see what's happening in the Sahel, Niger, Burkina Faso, the rollback of democratic institutions, constitutional rule, is like dominoes falling. So are we going to wait until the other countries fall before we describe those as conflicts? Because there's Sierra Leone. Yes, they did have an election, still very complicated. The opposition leader had to leave the country. Liberia, yes, series of elections, still just a post-conflict country. But when are we going to start seeing the potential conflicts, the early warning signs, instead of waiting for them to actually become conflicts when the signs are there? There's Burkina Faso. Before, they had many elections. After Campari, we had Niger, a series of elections, Mali. They're all run by the junta now. Guinea, the signs were there, but do we wait until they actually become conflicts before we project them at fora such as these? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll take a question from the gentleman here in the blue jacket.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim Aziz. You talk about you listed Syrian, Iran, and Palestinian and Israel as well in Middle East. But there is another conflict, which is the Kurdish conflict. A part of the Syria, part of the Iran, part of Kurd in Iraq, part in Turkey, and there is an armed conflict as well. How you are assessing that as a conflict in the Middle East? And we saw some development or some progress in Turkey right now. And there is a worries in Syria for withdrawing the troops in Syria, in the Kurdish area in the north. And in Iran as well, there is a worry about the Kurds there. Thank you very much.
And I'm going to take a third question as well. The lady in the front row just here. There we are.
Thank you so much for squeezing me in. Thank you both. This has been a fascinating conversation. Caitlin Vito, a member. Would you be able to say a few words to the muddying of the information space that we've seen and the impact that it's having across the conflicts that we've discussed and the impact that it's having on your work and how you're tracking it day to day? Thank you.
Great. And I'm just going to add online, Chiara Spadaro has also asked, what is the role of disinformation in these conflicts? Do you see disinformation as a tool used by countries directly or indirectly involved in the conflict? So really important point. So let's take those three questions.
Yeah, so it goes back to that list. If I had one more thing that I could list, I would talk about, last year we talked about disinformation, but it's just the power of technology today. You know, the FT wondered whether Trump was the real techno king as opposed to the Elons and the Mark Zuckerberg. And there's something to be said about that. Look, West Africa was where it all started for me, and to see sort of the reversal of fortunes. You know, I was a peacekeeper in Liberia, and I first started in Sierra Leone. So to see the investment that was made in the region sort of unravel in this way is worrying. But I think more worrying for me is to see the unraveling of the peace and security architecture of the region in the form of the Economic Community of West African States. So you know, this is a regional body that became the poster child for what the African Union is today. And it has struggled along with the UN, and it's hard to tell the story of West Africa or even a number of places beyond West Africa without recognizing that one of the most significant events that's happened in the last 3 years is the way in which France and other international actors have been kicked out of regions that were traditionally, they would shape politics in the region. So it's an indictment on a number of external actors, starting with France, with Europe, but also West Africa and ECOWAS itself. It's also a recognition that Nigeria, as a regional superpower, no longer is able to sort of nudge, and encourage certain good behavior in its region. It's also acknowledgement that the other two other significant powers that normally shaped West African politics, Libya is in crisis and Algeria is missing in action as well. But it's also a recognition that after 8 years of international action, the Malians themselves, the Burkina, despite the horrible news that's coming out of there, Niger, they said they want to take agency, they want to take back control, I hate to say it, they want to decide their future security because they haven't seen the gains from 8 years of international intervention. So I think we have to recognize that. And then the last word I would say is that, look, for an organization that spends a great deal of its time trying to fact verify, we're very careful about what we say. And I think what worries me is just the litany of disinformation that can do more harm to a conflict as it evolves, makes the life of mediators very difficult. And as an organization that's also suffered and been a victim of that, I see the downsides of, it's a double-edged sword. Social media is both a good thing, but it also, there's a negative, and how you manage that becomes crucial.
We're almost out of time. Do you have a quick word on the Kurdish issue, just in the last minutes?
I think one of the challenges going forward is this balance between Turkey and its backing of the SNF and then the Kurdish forces as well. And I think that conversation is going to be very contingent also on the conversation between Jelani and the new authorities and various minority groupings as well. not just for Syria, but you see with Turkey, it sees this very much as its moment of ascendancy. But I think there's a realization by the Syrians themselves that they have to weave a new fabric that deals with the various constituencies, including the various Kurdish forces in the country as well.
Fantastic. Listen, let's all thank Comfort for what has been a really wide-ranging discussion. And of course, to thank all of you who attended in person, all of you who attended online. My apologies if we didn't get to your questions in time. But I think an enormous amount to chew over and an enormous amount to be concerned about. But thank you for the insights. Yeah, great. Thank you. Brilliant. That's fantastic.